Good morning and welcome to Industrialization in Britain, a Revolution. These two pictures were taken at the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympics in London. On the left-hand side, Britain as the green and pleasant land. That's the official name of that concept in the opening ceremony. So Britain is essentially presented as a garden. On the right-hand side, Britain as an industrial powerhouse. A land of smoke and chimneys and hard work. Now, both these images have a long history, of course, and they have become enduring symbols of British culture, British identity. And in this presentation, we're going to take a brief and fairly superficial look at this and at the question whether the Industrial Revolution actually was a revolution and what it did to British culture. So, what kinds of things will I talk about in this presentation? First of all, I'll give you a definition of what revolutions actually are. Then we'll take a brief look at Great Britain before the industrialization, before we talk about industrialization itself. Then we'll move on to Britain after the industrialization. And finally, I'll sum up my key points in a nutshell. And then I will arrive at my conclusion. First of all, what is a revolution? People normally think of the French and American revolutions. In other words, political revolutions when they talk about revolutions. What this usually means is that there's fast and massive change that envelops society in its entirety, in the political realm, in the social realm, and in the economic realm. Now, before the industrialization, Britain was essentially a rural society, a society in which most people were farmers. It was also a society of estates. There were the nobility and the gentry, what we might now call the upper class, clergymen working for the church, and most people were peasants. Of course, there were cities where people had other occupations, but the majority of the population worked in agriculture. Essentially, these estates defined your social status. You could say that birth defined your social status because there was a very limited amount of social mobility. This also means that Britain was a mostly feudal society. The lords owned land, they enjoyed privileges, they had a high influence on lawmaking and on politics. The peasants, however, they lived and worked on the Lord's land and returned produce, at least theoretically, in return for protection. You could say that in this sense, Britain was not really a capitalist society before the Industrial Revolution, if it was a revolution. Because these farmers, and most people were farmers as I've pointed out, they didn't really work for profit. They also weren't employees in any modern sense. Yeah, they worked for themselves and for their communities, and of course for their lords. Money on the whole was also much less important. Of course, there were exceptions to this. The big cities had, of course, complex capitalist structures, but these cities were exceptions to the rule. Britain was also already a constitutional monarchy. I don't want to go into the details, but two landmarks are 1215, the Magna Carta, and 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Both landmarks limiting the power of the monarch, which results in the parliament becoming a key or the center of power in this society. However, This does not mean that Britain was a democracy. There were elections in some sense, but only 2% of the people had the right to vote. Now, what was industrialization? There were three main areas that were affected: technological change, economic growth, and structural change. Technological change. First of all, innovations like technological innovations like the spinning jenny and other innovations revolutionized the way people worked. This mainly in the textile industry at first. The steam engine is another example, revolutionizing the textile industry, and then mining, giving rise to the railway industries, etc. All of this together also led to the development of the factory system as we know it today, only with less robots, I suppose. Now, was this revolutionary? We'll see. The second main impact of the Industrial Revolution was economic growth. Before the Industrial Revolution or industrialization, there had basically been almost no growth at all. No growth or very, very, very limited amount of growth had been the norm. Now growth became the new standard. Economic growth became normal. In some cases, immense growth. As we can see, these inventions like the spinning jenny or the improved jenny with water power had a significant impact on economic growth in the modern era. Again, was this revolutionary? I suppose yes, quite so. The third area is structural in kind. You could call this the rise of the industrial sector and the decline of the agricultural sector. Now, what does this mean? This means that before industrialization, most people, as I've pointed out, worked in agriculture. Now, industrialization changed this. People flooded the industrial sector. They flooded the cities, and the industrial sector became really the area of the economy in which most people worked and were employed. What came later was the rise of the service sector. This is really something that happened only in the second half of the 20th century. Again, was this revolutionary? I suppose yes, extremely revolutionary. But of course, this was not something sudden. So we're going to have a closer look at that problem in the conclusion. Now, another massive change was that society became divided, or was increasingly divided in classes that replaced the estates that had existed earlier. The upper class, for example, basically still noblemen, gentry, but people saw them increasingly in terms of classes than in terms of estates. Especially because over time they lost many of the privileges and the special role in society that they used to have in the Middle Ages, for example. So they had to find other ways to distinguish, to set themselves apart, from the other classes in society. And of course, all of these classes did so through dress. We see this here in this picture. Hunting and the appropriate dress that goes alongside this. That's appropriate for a hunter. Became emblematic of upper class life. We can also see this in this modern photograph. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip who recently died, the Duke of Edinburgh, on a hunting expedition. Yeah. So we can say that these classes were and are a source of identity, yeah, for the people who belong to these classes. Now, the middle class also sought to set itself apart from other classes through dress. This is a famous industrialist, Brunel. We can see the top hat and the suit, especially the top hat being a symbol of his status as a rich capitalist of the middle class. He's also presented like in this manner in the opening ceremony, in this case played by Kenneth Branagh. Again, we can see that dress becomes a class marker. It shows that people identify themselves with their class, the class that they belong to, and they show this identification through their dress. This is also true of the working class, although the working class, of course, did not have really much choice in the way people dressed. Yeah, they were mostly poor. But still, things like these hats, for example, have become symbols of working class dress. Again, class became a source of identity for the British. This has to do with the development of a class consciousness. So people became aware of the fact that they belong to a certain class, upper class, middle class, working class. Behind this was the ideal of social mobility. This is different than in earlier times. So people started to believe in social mobility, the ideal of a meritocracy, being able to work yourself up in society. Britain was now a truly capitalist society. There were the feudal rights of the nobility or clergy were slowly but increasingly abolished, and it became a society of employer-employee relations, where people worked for wages. Profit became more important, profit and consumption, yeah, in a free market economy. And of course, and this was a result of all of this, time became much more important. It was especially the introduction of electric light meant that people were no longer dependent on daylight. Now, to put this in a very simplified nutshell, before industrialization, Britain was essentially a rural society. It became an industrial society. It had been a society of estates where birth defined your status. It became a society of classes where classes defined your social status, and in which there was more social mobility. But of course, this ideal of, I don't know, American rags to riches ideal, for example, yeah, where you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, this never materialized. Whereas Britain had been a feudal system before the Industrial Revolution, it became a capitalist system in the course of the Industrial Revolution. Before industrialization, there had been almost no economic growth. The industrial era and then later the post-industrial era were capitalist eras characterized by a lot of economic growth every year. And finally, whereas manpower had been the key, or horsepower and similar forms of power, yeah, had been key to production, now machines work with fossil fuels. And of course, this has had its own consequences that we all have to face today in terms of climate change. Now, was this revolutionary? Yes, there was massive political, social, and economic change. And yes, this seemed revolutionary to contemporaries. But change was slow, took centuries essentially. However, there was fast regional change. For example, in Manchester, people began to talk of Manchester capitalism in the 19th century, because the changes were so radical. Now, my conclusion. Industrialization was a slow process of radical political, social, and economic change that consisted of many small regional industrial revolutions that seem very far revolutionary to contemporaries. So a yes and no answer, yeah, but mostly yes. Thank you very much. These are my sources for those people who are interested in that, and thanks